here today with Dr. Yanis Varoufakis, soon to be a visiting professor at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. We're here to talk about his new book, The Global Minotaur, which is put out by Zed Books in their Economic Controversy series, I understand, which you can buy on Amazon or in many bookstores around the country. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rob.
Tell me, what is a global minotaur?
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor with which I decided to try to tell my story about what went wrong in 2008 and why is the world economy finding it so hard to rediscover its poise after that debacle in 2008. It's a metaphor which, the purpose of which was to capture something quite extraordinary that happened after the end of Bretton Woods in 1971. In 1944, as we all know, under the guidance of people like White and
Harry Dexter White
and John Maynard Keynes, the world tried to put in place a global economic system which featured effectively a common currency, more or less a fixed exchange regime, without the pitfalls of the gold standard that had preceded and which crashed and burned in 1929 with awful, hideous repercussions. And that the bit that was missing from the gold standard and which was put in place under Bretton Woods is what I call very simply a surplus recycling mechanism. The idea that just like in the United States, you have a common currency, the dollar, but you've got a very effective system, or at least variably effective, and at times very effective system of recycling surpluses within the United States.
Across the states and regions.
So if you do this within the United States, you do it within Germany, you do it within Britain, you do it within every currency union. Okay? You need to do it within the global system if you have a fixed exchange rate regime like you had in
so that the adjustment of the exchange rate doesn't, what you might call, dampen the shocks, the transfers dampen the shocks.
The shock absorbing system.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a system that ensures that when there is a recession, you don't have the catastrophe that you had in 1929 to 1932, with the burden of adjustment being placed on the deficit countries and regions which cannot, they cannot actually hold that kind of burden. And so in 1944, it was clear the United States was very keen to recycle its own surpluses. It happened in various different ways. The Marshall Plan is just one example, but just one of many different examples.
Foreign direct investments and...
Indeed. So American surpluses were being exported primarily to Europe and to Japan, creating the demand for American surpluses to be regenerated, to be reproduced. Now that first phase of the post-war era came to an end for a very simple reason. America became a deficit country by the mid-60s, let's say.
Yeah.
So that system entered into a period, quite prolonged period, about a decade of a crisis, which came to a head in 1971 with the dismantling of that system.
When the U.S. went off gold.
But what was remarkable after 71 is that the United States, I don't know to what extent it was conscious, even though Paul Volcker has written a beautiful paper in 1971 foreshadowing that when he was working for Henry Kissinger, before Henry Kissinger moved to the State Department. What happened was the United States decided that they will maintain their hegemonic position by recycling other people's surpluses.
So they became the deficit country.
So the American twin deficit, rather than being an accident, rather than being some sign of failure, was, in my estimation, this is what the story I'm telling in the book, it was a very important tool for maintaining world aggregate demand.
They became a magnet as the market of last resort.
Exactly. The American deficit was simply a vacuum cleaner sucking into the United States the net exports of Germany, of Japan, later of China, of the oil exporting countries. And that deficit had to keep growing as long as the world economy was growing. The question is, how do you finance this? Well, the answer almost spontaneously emerged. the success of American administrations, of successive American administrations, to squeeze labor costs within the United States, to squeeze inflation below that of its competitors. The Walmart and Wall Street model of economic growth.
Foreign direct investment, goods coming into
Effectively
America.
what happened, the surpluses that were being generated in Germany, in Japan, and later in China, flowed back like two huge tsunamis over the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, ending up in Wall Street, refinancing those. So the circle actually closed.
They used to say our comparative advantage is bonds.
Indeed, indeed. Now, this was a surplus recycling mechanism that worked, yet it had to keep becoming more and more unstable in order to keep working. On the back
It's not unlike the Triffin dilemma of years past, which was eventually people will hold a large stock of reserves that it can't be credible. In those days it was tied to gold, now it's more a question of solvency.
What made it, however, much more unstable and in the end brought about its undoing was the fact that if you have something like between $3 and $5 billion net flowing into Wall Street every working day, what do bankers do when you give them this amount of money to play with every day, even if you give it to them for 10 minutes?
They play.
They play, and they discover new financial instruments by which to make it grow for themselves. And this is my explanation of financialization, because we tend to blame the 2008 crisis on financialization, and rightly so, and the breakdown of this pyramid of instruments that were created as a result of financial engineering and all that. But this book tries to explain why financialization happened.
Well, at some level,
it was essential to this surplus recycling mechanism. So on the back of these tsunamis of capital flowing into Wall Street, a huge mountain range of private money was created, because those instruments effectively started being used as a means of exchange, stores of value, effectively became money. So it was like giving the financial sector an ATM in their living rooms and allow them to print as much. And if you can print, then you might as well print as much as you can. And under the weight of the hubris and of all these pyramids of toxic private money, the whole system eventually collapsed in 2008, which was inevitable that was going to happen. The tragedy is, for the world economy, that even though this nemesis was well deserved for Wall Street, by bringing down the financial system and effectively creating what I call a system of bankruptocracy, whereby the states are bankrolling bankers to remain in control of their bankrupt banks at the expense of the taxpayer. Nevertheless, even though the banks were saved in this way, Wall Street never managed to regain its capacity to recycle the surpluses of the Germans, of the Chinese, of the Japanese, and so on, in a way that keeps demand coming from the United States for foreigners' net exports going in order to carry on with the reproduction of the Eurozone, of the Chinese economy, of the Japanese economy. So that machine, recycling machine, broke down. It was never mended.
It's very interesting because in the United States, after the breakdown of Wall Street, the only means that was trusted was the government bond.
That's right.
And our government is paralyzed because the people in the United States, after the bailouts and bonuses, don't want to give them the authorization for more spending. The debt ceiling fight that we had.
Exactly.
Had we been rebuilding our infrastructure and our education, roads, bridges, the
that
recycling machine would have gotten another chapter.
What the Chinese are doing, in effect.
Yes.
The difference is that the Chinese have an internal migrational process which must be maintained by net exports, whereas the United States if it used a similar stimulus policy to the one that the Chinese are using, it would have managed to help the rest of the world regain the poise that it lost in 2008, with and that would have created a virtuous cycle for the United States as well.
Would have turned back on in using your metaphor.
So let me now come to my Global Minotaur. Where does it come from? When I was trying to put together a metaphor for explaining this surplus recycling mechanism and how it broke down in 2008, I was reminded of the story of the Minotaur. And the story of the Minotaur is a very sad and tragic tale. It's the story of the product of incest between a queen and a bull.
Yes.
It's half man, half bull. It lives in the labyrinth, which was built specially for it by the family that are embarrassed by it in the Cretan palace. Crete was the hegemon at the time. Crete had defeated the Athenians and the rest of the Greeks in the Eastern Mediterranean and had imposed a Pax Cretana. A Pax Cretana which was essential, even historians beyond the myth tell us that at that time we have lots of evidence of commerce and of significant economic growth as a result of commerce, which was imposed by the Cretan projection of power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So the myth is that in order to preserve this recycling of goods and services across the Eastern Mediterranean, which was the first stimulus, if you want, of the cradle of civilization, the Cretan Minotaur, that beast whose appetite could only be satiated by young men and women, had to be fed by constant tributes from Athens, so as to perpetuate that peace which led to prosperity throughout the region and to maintain the hegemonic power. So this is my metaphor. The tributes that came from the rest of the world to Wall Street was capital. The Minotaur was a deficit. And the labyrinth was Wall Street.
And do you see any hope now? How would the modern Keynes, going back to Bretton Woods, put this machine, this system together?
Well, let me remind you of which you don't need to be reminding, but let's reminding our listeners, of the point of contention between the Americans and the Brits in Bretton Woods, between White and Keynes. They both agreed that surplus recycling is essential, that you can't have a common currency without surplus recycling.
Yes.
Because if you do that, then you end up with what happened to the gold standard, what's happening to the Eurozone now. Because both the gold standard and the Eurozone are examples of fixed exchange rates without a formalized recycling mechanism.
And you have deflation.
Look at what's happening in the Eurozone. It's disintegrating, just like the gold standard was disintegrated after 1929. So White and Keynes were far ahead of our European leaders. They knew that there had to be recycling. The difference of opinion was that whereas Keynes wanted to institute, to found a well-defined and designed and international, quite democratic system of deciding how surpluses would be recycled between the surplus and the deficit nations, the United States of America, through White, were not interested in that. Said, it's our surpluses, we'll recycle them, but we're not going to decide together with you guys how we're going to do it. So we are going to do it ourselves, which was understandable to a large extent. But it was predicated upon the false assumption that the United States of America would continue to have surpluses, which it didn't. And when the surplus position of the United States turned into a deficit position, the whole thing came tumbling down. And in its stead, we had the Global Minotaur, which succeeded in creating a highly unbalanced growth spurt for 20, 30 years, based on financialization to a large extent and to the squeezing of US working people's living standards and creating the enormous inequities and inequalities that people like Jamie Galbraith describes so nicely in his book. And the result is that inequality, the diminution in the living standards of American workers, financialization, the growth of China, all that became part and parcel of what I call the Global Minotaur. And when the Global Minotaur was mortally wounded in 2008, the world lost its capacity to reproduce itself and to regain its footing.
Mm-hmm. And today, we are sputtering and have been sputtering for almost 2 years.
We will keep sputtering. Nobody seems to see that the great deficit we are facing is a deficit of aggregate demand.
Yes.
And it's because this recycling mechanism has broken down.
And do you think with, say, as compared to the 30s, with sovereign debt and private debt to GDP ratios all much higher, that there is a basis for the reluctance to stimulate aggregate demand? Or do you think that this is what you might call the Austerian's mirage, where we needn't worry?
I think we need to worry, and we need to worry a great deal, because the debt is not a problem.
Yeah.
This crisis, just like in the 1930s, come to think of it, has two different facets. One coin with two different faces. One face of it is the mountain of debt. If you look just at that mountain of debt, it looks stupendous, it looks huge, it looks worrying. And people say, oh my God, we have to cut. But what these people fail to see is there is another mountain of similar size, the mountain of savings that then don't have anywhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a mountain of savings, idle, not going into any productive investment because of the lack of confidence caused by the crisis and the lack of recycling, and you have a mountain of debt. Now, the only way of overcoming the crisis is by folding those two into one and recycling them in a way that restarts the economy, providing the missing link of the aggregate demand, not through taxing and spending, but through finding a way. Roosevelt did not tax and spend effectively. Roosevelt's whole point was how to put to work idle savings and do it
regenerate the real economy.
Exactly. He succeeded to some extent. Well, now, do we need a world war, or can we act rationally without one? That is the big question.
Well, I think that's a very important question, because it would be unprecedented for us to act rationally without the war.
But let's hope that this is, one of those occasions in history when we do something for the first time. My great worry is my home continent, Europe. Because Europe is, I think the United States has learned a huge lesson from the 1930s. Even though you had a period of inanity with Alan Greenspan and the neoliberals effectively losing the plot of not understanding what happened really in 1929. Still, in this country, the United States of America, there is a deep appreciation of what really went down. Mm-hmm. Europe seems to have forgotten that. And I blame America for that.
For not engaging them?
For allowing particularly the Germans to get away with thinking that that it is possible to sustain a growth long term by treating a large economy like Germany or the Eurozone as if it were a magnificent workshop, where all you have to worry about is the quality of the products and not to worry about where demand will come from. And the reason why they didn't have to worry about that was between 1944 and 2008, the United States of America, either through the Bretton Woods system of recycling or the Global Minotaur system of recycling, was ensuring that there would always be demand for Mercedes-Benzes and German capital goods. After 2008, it is China's stimulus economic policies that are doing this job for Germany. At some point, Germany and the Europeans must decide that Europe is rich enough, it has sufficient problems, and they can be dealt with endogenously within Europe. But that requires that Europe will have to come to terms with the fact that there is no American hegemon anymore to look after the generation of sufficient demand for the sale of European exports overseas.
And do you think that the Germans can break the habit of needing to have a surplus in order for their economy to function?
Look, there are always going to be surplus countries, and there are always going to be deficit countries. The important thing, and that's what Keynes taught us, is that you need to have the recycling. Yeah. So I don't have a problem with Germany. Germany will always have a surplus. I mean, they are just, such a strong industrial society, and, I applaud them for that. They have to look after the recycling. They've got to understand that the reason why they were so successful from the end of the war to 2008 to today is because other nations were taking care of recycling that was beneficial to them. Those other nations, first the United States and soon China, will no longer be able to do that. And with wealth comes responsibility.
Let me turn things in a slightly different direction within Europe. In the United States, in addition to the transfer mechanism, we have another feature that takes pain out of the system. It's labor mobility. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, we've talked a little bit like financing is the residual of the surplus recycling, mm-hmm. but sometimes autonomous capital flows build the bubbles. Absolutely. The capital with the fixed exchange rate ran into Spain,
of course,
build up the housing,
Greece, Portugal,
and now it's withdrawn, mm-hmm. what Guillermo Calvo calls the sudden stop. But with the sudden stop and the downturn, labor cannot move back with the capital to the surplus countries as readily as it could move from, say, Detroit to North Carolina in the United States. So is the capacity of Europe to withstand this challenge and not have what you might call political rupture or social instability, is it not, how would I say, deficient when you have labor immobility and capital mobility combined in a system?
You're absolutely right. Mind you, over the last year and a half, ever since the crisis in the Eurozone began, we observe a lot more labor mobility. There are now hundreds of thousands of Spaniards and Greeks and Portuguese migrating to Germany. Oh. We already have that, but at the same time, this degree of increased flexibility has not managed to ameliorate the crisis, to rebalance the Eurozone, okay. Which means that the increased flows of migrants are accompanied by increased misery. And when you have a combination of increased flows of migrants and increased misery, the neo-Nazis have a party everywhere, in the south, in the north, in the east, and the west.
Yeah, the polarization everywhere.
I don't believe in automatic stabilizers. I don't believe that this, you see, I mean, the Eurozone is so badly designed that even if you introduced perfect labor flexibility, American style, even more, it still wouldn't be enough. We have banking sectors that are separate. The walls between the French banking sector, the German banking sector. You have at the moment the insolvent Spanish government, effectively insolvent, trying to lend money to insolvent banks to save them from bankruptcy. There is no degree of labor flexibility that can fix these design faults.
Mm-hmm. So I know you have a website where you discuss these issues frequently, and you have a document which is now famously named The Modest Proposal on the Repair of Europe. And how do I say? And we have the Global Minotaur. You've written a wonderful textbook with two co-authors on called Modern Political Economics. I think in many respects you're illuminating the contemporary challenges and the deeper challenges of theory, and we're grateful for your being with us today.
Grateful for what you do here at INET.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.